I'm Tobias Revel.
And I'm Radha Mystery.
And this is Futur-ish, a podcast about how nothing is new and everything has happened before.
We've been working and playing in futures for over a decade of hype and bluster amidst increasing uncertainty and complexity.
In each episode, we explore a recent event or signal for its historical context and speculate on future possibilities.
And make it make sense for people like you and me. I'm very excited about today because we're going to talk about two of your least favorite things ever. One is a profession that I think carries lots of prestige and honor. And we're also going to talk about American politics a little bit. Are you ready?
Both things, point of fact, just to clear this up at the beginning, are actually a blight on human civilization.
I know.
Fine.
You think okay, you know what? We're just going to leave this for later on in the discussion and you can air all your grievances. Okay, so the big news over here in architecture land is that as part of Trump's One Big Beautiful Bill, architecture is no longer going to be considered a professional degree.
Quite right.
Keep your joy and celebration to yourself, sir, because two of my degrees are from architecture.
Sensible policies.
Oh, come on.
America.
I need to reevaluate our friendship, Tobias. I can't believe you're agreeing with this man. How dare you? So there's a few different threads that I kind of wanted to pull here. The first is that as part of the terms of the One Big Beautiful Bill, architects along with other careers, so nursing and accounting, are also going to be demoted and will not be considered as professional degrees, which is also not great, right? Like, one of the things we have to consider is these professions do take on a certain amount of liability when they conduct the work that they do, right? So when an architect stamps drawings, they are saying, I am putting my legal stamp on this thing to say, to my knowledge, these are adequate, satisfactory to be able to be built, right? Or to work towards a construction project. Now, one of the kind of primary implications of this demotion of architecture to not being a professional degree is that it will affect the provision of student loans starting July 1st of 2026. So borrowing amounts are going to be set based on whether a degree is professional or not. And so what that means is that for graduate students, the borrowing cap will be $20,500 per year. And for professional students, that will cap at $50,000.
So to be clear, an architecture degree is being downgraded from professional to just a graduate thing.
Mm-hmm. To just a degree, like a liberal arts degree, right? And so there's a few things here is that cap will drastically reduce the number of people who can study architecture because it is not the cheapest of educational programs to take on. Most of the time, a bachelor's degree is at minimum 5 years. And then a master's degree after that can be anywhere from like 1 to 2.5 years to complete, depending on, what your undergraduate degree was. So you can already start to imagine that there will be a significant shift in who can study architecture and where that can happen, right? And perhaps there are some implications here where it's like, okay, maybe it's now accessible at the community college level and you don't have to go to a 4-year university, and we can kind of weigh the pros and cons of what that means. But it also means that if we think about the wider ecosystem of who is shaping the built environment, there are so many things we learned in an architecture curriculum that you're not necessarily going to get in an apprenticeship because it depends on how strong your mentors are, right? Whereas when you go through an architectural education program here, if the program is accredited, it has to meet some pretty stringent conditions so that you qualify to then do your intern development programming, and then you can study for all of the exams and your certifications and everything else, and then become part of the AIA. And as I was kind of reading more about this, one of the articles that I read also mentioned that on his first day in office, Trump signed an executive order to specifically promote classical architecture in federal buildings. Have you heard of this as well?
I do remember this. It's all about bringing back neoclassical architecture that was itself already a pastiche of European architecture, that was already a pastiche of ancient Greek architecture.
Precisely. So basically, this was not Trump's first executive order towards this mandate. The first one was killed by Biden like 69 days after it was established. But then when Trump was reelected, on his first day in office, he revived this executive order. And the executive order is titled Making Federal Architecture Beautiful Again.
Because it was beautiful to begin with. I mean, that's something that people say it really lost its luster.
You think so?
Yeah. I mean, the FBI building, what a banger.
Let me just share a little bit about what this executive order is kind of demanding, right? So it starts off saying the founders, in line with great societies before them, attached great importance to federal civic architecture. They wanted America's public buildings to inspire the American people and encourage civic virtue. And then it kind of goes on to say that like President George Washington and Thomas Jefferson consciously modeled the most important buildings in DC on the classical architecture of ancient Athens and Rome. They sought to use this classical kind of vernacular to visually connect our contemporary republic with the antecedents of democracy.
Rome was particularly well known for its democracy.
Right. I mean, obviously. And so in section 2 of this executive order, there's a mandate that says applicable federal public buildings should uplift and beautify public spaces, inspire the human spirit, ennoble the United States, and command respect from the general public. However, general public means members of the public who are not artists, architects, engineers, art or architecture critics, instructors, or professors of art or architecture, or members of the building industry. That is the general public, okay? So anyone who has anything to do with built environment or an opinion on aesthetics, not allowed to be the general public, first of all.
I believe that's called regulatory shade.
I was like kind of offended when I read this, okay?
Yeah, just to single people
like, how
out.
dare
Like,
they?
Not you.
How
your
dare
opinion.
they?
I mean, it's very interesting that they've singled out the disciplinary experts as the people who aren't to be cared for. I mean, I probably can imagine putting together like an education policy and saying, yeah, we really value the public opinion, except educators,
teachers,
pedagogues, people who study education, teachers, inspectors of schools. Those people don't count.
Like, would you develop medical kind of policy around healthcare and not include or consult doctors? Oh, wait, we do that in this country, but that is another story for another time. Okay, so there is something to be said here about the fact, as you had said so succinctly, that they're really preferring classical architecture over, what they're calling kind of like brutalist or more modernist architecture. But one of the things that I was really interested in here was like, if we are reverting back to these older aesthetic movements and kind of design movements, what are we losing in that process? Have you heard of neuroarchitecture?
I haven't heard of neuroarchitecture.
Okay, so there's this woman that a friend of mine had told me about. Her name is Cleo Valentine. And she talks a lot about the connection between architecture and like psychology and the impact that it has on our brains. So there have been lots of studies over the last like 10 to 15 years that says that essentially that our brains are wired to be able to assess threat, right? And where we feel the most comfortable is in natural environments. So trees, mountains, forests, lakes, rivers, all these things, these kind of natural landscapes. What is stressful to us in the way that we take in information is when we see lots of repetitive patterning and things like lots of lines in repetition with one another and things like that. So
really? That doesn't feel intuitive to me. I would have thought that, you mentioned forest, for example. I would have thought there's something quite primal almost about the chaos and unknown of the forest versus, because bear with me, historically humans have found order to be soothing, whether it's literally putting forests into order so they're more easy to manage for sort of the purpose of forestry, whether it's arranging cities into blocks so it's easier to understand. It feels counterintuitive that that's the thing that causes stress and not noise and chaos and uncertainty.
So I'm glad you said that. That is part of it, of course. But one of the things that some of these studies have found in nature as a general rule, components with low spatial frequency, like large stripes, have high contrast, and components with high spatial frequency, small stripes, have a lower contrast. So if you are looking at a bunch of trees in a forest, there isn't such a stark difference between maybe the tone of the tree and what you're seeing behind it or in front of it.
Literally seeing the forest for the trees.
Yeah, exactly. Literally, right? So we can call this simple relationship between spatial frequency and contrast a quote unquote rule of nature. And basically what that means is that scenes from nature have stripes that tend to cancel each other out so that when added together, no stripes appear in the image. So it's not like a jarring image for us to see. There's not this high contrast, as opposed to if you think about the urban environment, right? It tends to feature these regular kind of repetitive patterns just because of the way we've set up things on a grid, the way we think about standardized window framings, staircases, railings, And a lot of this is also attributed to like how building code has been developed over time. So for example, if you have a guardrail, the guardrail has to have a certain amount of components within the railing to ensure that like a baby's head could not fit through them, right? And that is a repetitive pattern. And of course, people have come up with interesting patterns and like aesthetically beautiful things to kind of look at. But the standard, the most cost-effective kind of solution for most of the things we put out into the world are these like simple kind of repetitive systems, right? And so there's a lot of research out there that basically says that that is not good for our brains. And there is now research that has come out that says there's potentially some causation between like living in the urban environment and a proclivity towards mental conditions like schizophrenia. Okay. So in one of the articles I had read about how looking at buildings can actually give people headaches, what they found in some of their studies was that they analyzed images of apartment buildings and found that over the last 100 years, the design of buildings has been departing further and further from that initial rule of nature that I mentioned. More and more stripes appear decade by decade, making the buildings less and less comfortable to look at, essentially. And then the other thing that they mentioned was that in order for your brain to take in these high contrast, highly repetitive images, your brain ends up using a lot more oxygen, actually. So all around, cities, not good. Or the ways we design cities right now, our urban buildings, not great. Okay. I don't think classical architecture and neoclassical architecture is the solution to this. But I do think there is a question about what does architecture need to become as we think about not only the health of the planet and the health of people, but like how we think about mental health as well. So the reason that I was really interested in Cleo Valentine is because she is a systems designer and a neuroarchitectural researcher. And she says that it's estimated that residents in developed economies spend up to 95.6% of their time in or around the built environment. This trend towards increased architectural exposure has attracted considerable research, particularly concerning its effects on health. However, there is still relatively little known about the impact of architectural form on the brain. So the field of neuroarchitecture has kind of emerged in this attempt to bridge that gap between how the built environment affects our brain and our kind of behavior and cognition. Researchers have found evidence that exposure to specific variations in architectural form may mediate physiological stress responses. And one of the examples that she has brought up in interviews before is like how stressful it is to find the exit at an IKEA. And so her research really focuses around the relationship between architectural design and what she calls neuroinflammation, which is from the field of neuroimmunology. Neuroinflammation has been implicated in the development of multiple neurological disorders, including depression, dementia, and schizophrenia. So what she's really curious about is like the impact of visual exposure to selected architectural forms and how can we use what we're learning about how architecture impacts the brain to build healthier environments. I feel like there's something here, and we obviously both work in the built environment. There's so much that we do in our own research when we think about concepts like regenerative design and approaches to sustainable development. But I feel like there's an opportunity to think about a new vernacular or like a new approach to designing for the built environment. So we're not having to default to, Trump's mandate for like classical architecture because brutalism isn't working for him or something. A lot of these studies acknowledge like there is noise pollution, there is, overcrowding, there is traffic, there are all these other things that are massive stressors. However, I feel like oftentimes when we think about what is stressful, what I find to be interesting is there are more and more studies that are starting to explore this relationship between architecture and the brain.
And the speculation to go the other way is quite interesting. Another precursor to the executive order is like fascist architecture from the 1930s and 40s, which, as I'm sure you'd know better than I, had a bunch of decisions in it which were about both symbolic and literal behavioral control, let's say. So the windows are above eye height, so you can't actually look out. So everything feels bigger than you. Everything is designed to make you feel small and insignificant in the scale of this program that they're engaged with, and those sort of designs that Hitler had for the redesign of Berlin, and similar for Stalin's Russia as well.
And I will say this, like when I first saw that executive order, I was like, oh, here comes fascism in architectural form. This is a person who is trying to demonstrate power in some way, right? So I think I took a challenge to myself to be like, okay, let's not go down, the the swirling drain of doom, let's try to say, if we were to take this as an opportunity to kind of think of a positive outcome, or maybe as an inflection point to do better, what if we don't look back? What happens if we look forward, right? What might we do differently? Because we're essentially saying, let's do more of the same in that executive order.
Are there any new buildings going up in the inimitable Trump style?
Well, so he has recently demolished the east wing of the White House. I don't know if you are aware of this.
Listen, of course I am. He's a man of great taste, and I respect his choices.
You love gold and decadence. So there's plans to kind of build a ballroom and at the presidential residence. And then he also has proposed a classical style triumphal arch to be built in Washington, D.C.
I mean, that's very problematic because triumphal arcs have a real history of people building them to go under them to overturn whoever was already there, whether it's Napoleon or Marcus Augustus. You know, it's not a great history.
No, it's definitely not. Like, historical precedent is not in our favor here. And by our, I mean the general public, although I am not included in the general public because I am unfortunately of the architectural profession.
Does that order mean that you're just out of the general public on all matters? Or
maybe
is it
on
just
everything.
on
like, it doesn't matter if I vote. I don't understand. No policy, no opinion on policy.
It's also interesting that he's conflating anything that's not the neoclassical style with brutalism, which is also a very specific French style from the 1960s and 70s.
It was basically like anything from brutalism all the way up to like more contemporary styles of architecture. So like definitely not going to see these blobular forms, not going to see a more kind of like modernist.
Not going to get a Zaha Hadid pentagon.
No. May she rest in peace. But, you know, even things like the San Francisco Federal Building that was designed by Morphosis here in Los Angeles, like things like that, we would not be allowed to design.
It's a nice build.
It is a nice building. I used to walk by it all the time.
That's quite European, actually. I'd expect to see that in like the outer suburbs of Paris or something.
Everything is not European. Sometimes things are just what they are from where they are.
What, a city with the name San Francisco isn't European? Sure, if you say so.
Do you really think... Wait, what are the origins of San Francisco? Because it could be Mexican.
Which is then Spanish.
No. Spain and Mexico, very different, my friend. Very different. As someone who's married to a Portuguese woman, you should understand this. How dare you? Wow.
Well, I would also say Brazilian is Portuguese. Brazilian culture is Portuguese culture.
And how does your wife feel about that?
She'd be very proud.
Would she?
Yeah, I'll edit this out.
Okay, so San Francisco originated with a Spanish settlement in 1776 named Yerba Buena after a native plant and was later renamed San Francisco by Americans in 1847. But again, by colonizers from Spain. Anyway, we digress. You made a point about like how traditional architecture or classical architecture has frequently been used to support what I will call violent political agendas. So not great for our political outlook here. But if we were to take this and kind of flip it on its head and say, okay, if we go down the path that people like Cleo Valentine are starting to kind of forge for us, and we talk about things from the perspective of neuroarchitecture, and we take seriously these claims that there is some causation between the built environment and mental health, right? And there are studies like you and I have done research around designing for neurodivergence and things like that in the built environment, right? And some of our kind of thought leadership stuff. So I don't think that these conversations are so absurd within the communities that we operate in with built environment practitioners. I think what I'm curious about is like, what does that open up? What does that open up when we think about what the aesthetic of the built environment starts to look like? And then if we go in this other direction, like what are we going to lose? And I think, put simply, I do think that it is a threat to innovation, to sustainable design goals, and to some of the other things we have talked about, like regenerative design principles.
It reminds me, sort of not entirely unrelatedly, of like dazzle camouflage. Dazzle camouflage was a method of camouflaging ships, particularly around the Second World War, where ships were identified largely by their silhouette against the horizon. So you pop up your periscope if you're in a submarine, or use your binoculars if you're on another boat, and you sort of look at the silhouette of it, and you try and figure out what it is, and then figure out if it's a good guy or a bad guy, and then whether you're going to blow it up or not. Navy started doing was they would draw like really dramatic kind of patterns all over the side of the ship. They were really like, you know, just jagged, abstract lines and shapes The purpose being that it breaks up the silhouette of the ship and makes it harder to interpret what the actual shape of it is, because it's all distorted. Because you can't hide a ship. The sea's just big and flat. Like, it's really hard to hide. And so that was tapping into like a neuropsychological effect where the eye couldn't resolve what it was seeing with a sort of form or a shape, and it kind of distorted the brain. And so dazzle camouflage actually has become a kind of a euphemism for other types of similar effects. So for instance, there was a thing from Adam Harvey a few years ago called CV Dazzle, where he designed various makeup regimes that would break facial recognition algorithms. So again, breaking up the contours of the face so that the computer vision systems couldn't discern the features on the faces easily. What if buildings are kind of hidden somehow, or emphasized or brought out, or whatever they are, by different sort of neuropsychological effects? But also, I think if you're just trying to make the built environment a more pleasant place to be, there are easier ways of doing it, than
but I don't know if it's about it being more pleasant. I think it's about like designing spaces that at least allow our brains to not input it as a threat. Yes, that maybe comes out to something that's more pleasant, but I think you could have maybe like an ugly architecture that neurologically is very, very good for our brains, right? The other thing I'm reminded of is forever and ever and ever, architects have been talking about how we leverage architecture to manipulate experience or to signal cultural shifts towards something. And an example that comes to mind is like Frank Lloyd Wright's model of the Usonian home, which was demonstrating what the nuclear family was and how they might move through their day, and what are the most valuable spaces within that floor plan? What does our life look like? And so I think if we start to kind of go down that vein, what I also find to be really interesting is like the image of a Waymo driving in front of the Pantheon.
It's probably, again, a more influential force on the built environment, which is what James Bridle and others a few years ago called the new aesthetic, which is this idea that we're designing physical reality for machines to read.
Yeah.
So, whether it's the appearance of QR codes and fiduciary markers all over the place, or you're going to have to start thinking about redesigning the street just for autonomous vehicles. And so you start having bits of the built environment which are not for humans to look at, but are for machines to look at to understand what, things are. And then I would imagine, again, that's a psychologically more oppressive place, because you've got this layer of machine readable stuff on the built environment that's not for people to see.
And there's so much research out there on the ways in which we design our digital interfaces and how that affects our behavior and cognition, right? But if we kind of bring that through this field of like neuroarchitecture into the design for the built environment, what does that start to mean for the way we think about the built environment, where it's not just what is our occupancy? Are we hitting all of our programmatic requirements? Is this addressing building code? Are we hitting our sustainable design goal? Like, what happens when the neurological impact and the legibility to these kind of technological systems that we also have to interface with become a very integral part of the design process? How does that change the approach and the language of architectural aesthetic?
Well, can I ask you a difficult question? Is it maybe time to let architecture go? I don't know. I don't know enough about it.
I mean, it's interesting, right? Like, you've just pissed off so many people, but yeah.
I don't mind. Those people are already pissed off with me because I feel somewhat this way about design, as we've talked about before on this very podcast, right? That design sort of at this peak super intellectualism where it's perhaps not doing what it should be doing, which is being a generous force of change positively, hopefully, in the world.
Well, here's what I'll say. I don't know why you're coming after architecture. I feel like you have a personal vendetta, and I don't appreciate it. What I will say
I'll tell you what. Let me just explain why. It's because architects are so miserable, and I just don't want people to be that miserable.
I understand, and I will say this as somebody who went through architecture school for 2 degrees. What needs to change is architectural education, because I don't think you can talk about where the profession is without talking about where the education system is. So for me, it's like when you go to architecture school, and this is no secret, it is an incredibly toxic environment. There is very little care for mental and physical health and well-being. And actually, oftentimes what you are told is that like you have to demonstrate your dedication to the field. You have to really be a diehard. You have to kind of like let all of your other bodily needs and desires go. And I think what has happened is there are generations upon generations of architects who have educated the next generation with that same kind of point of view. And so I think what does need to shift is like, yes, historically it has been incredibly elitist, because who could afford an architectural education? Who was allowed to be in those rooms, right? And who was then designing these spaces in their own vision that were not very inclusive, right? Like women were not allowed in those spaces. When my aunt was an architecture student in the 80s, and she was like one of 5 women in a class of maybe 100, and forget being like a woman of color in those spaces, right? So I think there's the question we really need to be asking ourselves is like, how are we educating the future to be thinking about the built environment? And I wonder if it's bringing in these disciplines like neuroarchitecture, where we are considering the psychology as part of the practice of designing for space. We're never given that as formal training to think about like, how does this affect a person? But you also know if you design a space that has no light, has low ceilings, and is completely made of concrete where noise bounces off the thing, it's pretty unpleasant feeling to walk through that space.
There's some really interesting work going on, for example, on video game architecture. So people have been doing architecture in video games, as in designing spaces and structures for people to move through video games for decades now. And there's some really interesting places where that is now being reversed and saying, well, let's just take some of the stuff that game designers have figured out and start to apply it to real life, like how you show what path you're supposed to take, or make things feel either cramped and confined or big and expansive, or do tricks with perspective, all sorts of stuff like that. And also taking some of those new ways of designing in the first place. So not starting from a master plan perspective, but actually starting from, okay, you have to walk from here to here. What should you encounter along the way in order to do that?
So like if you think about SciArc, where I am over here, the Southern California Institute of Architecture, our friend Liam Young runs a program. It's an MA in fiction and entertainment, because I think he saw the need to have a space like that for people who were interested in architecture but didn't want to go through the full pathway to licensing to become architects. So there is still value in some of the principles of an architectural education, but I do think the overarching culture around it does not necessarily set us up for what we need in the future. But I don't think that means you kill the whole profession. I do still think there is value in learning how to think that way and considering the built environment. But I do think perhaps the ecosystem maybe needs to expand a little bit. And the disciplines that we bring into the conversation for what needs to happen to the built environment, like how cool would it be to be consulting a psychologist every single time we're designing a building, and a technologist, and somebody who thinks about early childhood development, and somebody who's thinking about the planet. But we don't do that.
You're saying that I may not need to kill off the architecture profession, but that's fine because your president has. So that's not on my docket anymore.
Goodness gracious.
There are, of course, regulations across the world about what can be built. And it seems to me a somewhat logical extension to take that all the way down to, the whole design of a vernacular for a nation. What becomes really interesting then is like, what if those guys start thinking about architecture as like a video game, if they start thinking about architecture neuropsychologically, if it's not just like symbolic brash, but is actually well thought in behavioral direction and control.
Yeah, but hopefully they don't figure that part out, right? The connection that's striking to me at this time that feels mildly problematic is the mandate being driven forward by this executive order, and also the demotion of architecture as a professional degree, and essentially what that means for who gets to learn about architecture and become an architect. I think that's why I'm finding myself delving into some of these other disciplines like neuroarchitecture and thinking about them from that perspective, because the other side of this conversation would just make me cry, basically, So it's like, all right, what do we actually have control over here? Or like, how can we start to influence this in a positive way?
Well, luckily we work at a massive engineering firm that designs the built environment. So
imagine that.
We're not totally without agency in this fight.
That's very true. Exactly. So come on, let's get to it then.
Well, you're going to get on with it because it's the start of your day. I'm going to go back downstairs and eat dinner with my family.
Enjoy your family and your dinner.
Toodles.
Bye.